Have you played Atari today?
Hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Classic Gaming Brothers. I'm Seth.
And I'm Zach.
And we're the Classic Gaming Brothers.
Yes. Yes, we are. That is correct.
We are. We've
done
right. it. We've done it. This is our 24th episode today.
Yeah?
It's pretty exciting.
It's always exciting.
Every episode's exciting.
Every episode. Nice. I like that.
Yeah. Every episode. We always have very riveting content. And I'm always very
and we've
excited
nailed these intros down. I mean, we are experts at starting a podcast.
Yes, pretty much the first 10 seconds might be a pretty good intro, and then it just goes off the rails from there.
Goes off the rails. It is like a train crash.
So, anyway, what have you recently been playing, Zach?
Well, I've recently been playing Rise of Nations, which is a real-time strategy game developed by Big Huge Games and published by Microsoft Game Studios. I've been playing the extended edition, which was developed by Skybox Labs, and released not too long ago. I think only within around 2017 they did the re-release. The original version came out in 2003 for Microsoft Windows. It is kind of along the lines of similar Microsoft Game Studio real-time strategy games. So very similar to like Age of Empires or Age of Mythologies.
Right.
But it was also developed at the time by a guy named Brian Reynolds, who was a designer over from Civilization 2 and Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. So when he came over to work on this game, he brought over some turn-based strategy elements into a real-time strategy game.
Yeah, it's like a blend, isn't it? Like between Civ and RTS?
Yeah, so there's a standard campaign that plays pretty much like your usual RTS campaign. And then there's also these Conquer the World campaigns that play a bit more like Civ. You have these territories that you have to take control of, and it's turn-based, so either the computer or the people you're playing against get a turn to take over territories. But the different thing that doesn't happen in Civ is when you move to attack a territory, it switches into the RTS mode, and then you actually play out the battle in a real-time strategy setting.
It's kind of like the Total War series.
Yeah, it does do something similar to Total War there. There's also other things that you can do in this game that are different than real-time strategy games. For example, you can beat enemies by attrition warfare. Right. So you don't necessarily need to destroy the enemy. You can just make sure that they can no longer function as a society because they no longer have any resources. And that is a valid way of stopping a computer or another player. The game also has a huge tech tree, so you start off in the prehistoric age and you end in the kind of like a future modern age, where you can go from pretty much people who throw rocks to stealth bombers with nuclear tipped missiles. Right. So it's a wide variety of gameplay. I know my friends hate playing it with me because I played the campaign for like a solid week back in college, and then my friends decided to play with me, and before they were even out of like the middle of the Bronze Age, I was developing nuclear subs and like surrounding their islands. And then like one of my buddies was like just moving into like the coal age or something, and I launched an ICBM at his capital and wiped him out.
Nice.
So yeah, it's a game that is, I think it's a lot of fun. I definitely like the kind of blend of turn-based and real-time strategy elements. And I'm a big real-time strategy fan, so it's I definitely recommend picking up the extended edition copy on Steam. I'm fairly certain it has all of the DLC, or expansion packs that were out for the game back in the early 2000s, as well as being 4K compatible now and very pretty. Yeah.
I always feel like I always want to play the Total War series, but I'm also very bad at the Total War series. So I've never really mastered the ability to control units beyond like a strategy of like charge at the enemy.
Oh yeah.
Now everyone's fleeing. I guess I lost this round. I'm like the autocomplete guy in any of the Total War series, but Rise of Nations, I don't know. I think I'd play that again.
Yeah, if you have familiarity with the Age of Empire games, you'll be going into a familiar territory. A lot of the base building elements of the real-time strategy part of the game are straight out of Age of Empires.
Yeah, which I enjoyed.
What about you, Seth? What have you been playing?
So I've actually recently been playing a game called The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past.
I think I've heard of that one.
It's a game that was originally released on the Super NES back in 1991. Eventually was ported to the Game Boy Advance, and that happened in the early 2000s, 2002 for North America. And then I've recently been playing it on the Switch because it's available. So if you subscribe to the Switch internet, I guess the online play for the Switch.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
If you subscribe to that, you can get access to NES and SNES classics.
Yeah.
And
which is pretty cool.
Part of the subscription. So if you're part of a big family plan, or if you're an individual plan, it's pretty reasonable. I think the online plan's not that crazy.
I think it's $20 a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is ridiculously inexpensive for what it's offering.
Right. Yeah, especially since you get all the NES games, and you can play online with your friends. So if you want to play Stardew Valley or something, you can play Stardew Valley online, which I have.
Nice.
But I'm playing Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. I actually never beat the game, so I'm looking forward to beating this Legend of Zelda game. I just got the Courage Pendant, and I'm working on my way of getting the second. I'm in the desert dungeon.
Yeah. Okay.
So what's cool about it's actually funny. I feel like the world of A Link to the Past is much smaller than it should be.
Yeah.
So I'm always going to like the world map, and I'm like, well, this is like the first stage, and then I'm like, no, this is it. This is the entire world. You could just view on the map, and you could just kind of walk around. Like, I just thought that was kind of interesting, being primarily an Ocarina of Time Zelda player.
Yeah.
Going where the world map was pretty intense.
Yeah.
And Breath of the Wild's got a huge world too.
Yeah.
World map. But so this one it's fun. I've actually seen some really cool 3D maps. So you can get the Legend of Zelda Link to the Past world map as a shadow box. And
I think cool. I've seen those for sale. Yeah. They're really, really cool.
Get them on Etsy or something like that. It's cool what people have done. I feel like a lot of our generation is okay with like selling. It's like a conflagration of people who have grown up with it and also having the internet. So you can now like sell stuff. Like you can buy like the X-Men arcade game Shadowboxed or stuff like just stuff that's more geeky and stuff like that.
Yeah,
like an art form.
I noticed with the shadow boxes, some of the ones I've seen for sale at conventions like PAX and a couple other conventions I've been to, they'll sometimes have like niche games. Like I'll see something, I'm like, I didn't think anyone else played that game, and someone made a shadow box for it, which is like awesome. Yeah, which I guess is how they're getting their sales, is because someone like myself will be like, oh, you made a Rystar shadow box, I'm definitely going to buy that.
I'll buy that $140 later.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it's very cool, having that market out there.
So yeah, so it's the Legend of Zelda. There's beyond, it's a traditional top-down game that most of our listeners should be familiar with.
The important question is, have you found the Chris Houlihan room yet?
I have not.
Okay.
I am. I will make sure I go to it before I complete the game.
Pay your respects.
Pay my respects to Chris Houlihan.
Yeah.
You can learn more about The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past by listening to our SNES episode where we talk a little bit about it. That was earlier than this episode.
And so I think that's a great segue into our...
I'm really good at segueing.
You are. Into the kind of main chunk of our episode. We're actually going back a bit to, we did our Sega episode where we talked about Sega Genesis. Yep. We did our NES episode. We talked about the Nintendo Entertainment System. We did the Super Nintendo. We did the N64. And now we're just going to hop back in our time machines and go back to the near very beginning and talk about the Atari 2600, a video game system that Seth and I have played, neither of us grew up with.
Correct.
as Correct. For clarification.
Yeah, and we didn't own one either.
No. So, I mean, jumping right into our memories, I guess, I personally did not own an Atari until I was in high school when I started getting into retro game collecting, and I went to a place called Game Underground, which was in Framingham. And in Game Underground, which was one of the first non-major, like non-chain video game store that I had been in. It was the first like independent video game store I had been in. And they had an Atari 2600 there for sale, and I had never even seen one in person. And I was like, I want that. And I didn't buy it because I didn't have any money at the time, but my mom was our mom was very sweet and ended up buying it for me for a gift as an early birthday gift or something. It was like $30, so it wasn't that expensive. And it took me some time getting it to work, but eventually I got it to work and I started to enjoy the blips and bloops of the Atari. And to this day, I still have my Atari 2600 that I had in high school, and I still play it every now and then. And it's a fun little system to play with. I have made some modifications over the years to make it a little more quality of life, but it's a good system. What about you, Seth? What memories do you have playing Atari?
So my memories of playing Atari are very scattered memories of being a child and going to, I assume, friends' houses. They were maybe our mother's friends, and they had children. They had these people that I vaguely remember. They had an Atari 2600, and I played a couple of games with them on that Atari 2600, including the combat game, which has got tanks, which we'll talk about. And I remember it had like a wood grain on the machine itself.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminded me of the station wagon of consoles. It was just kind of very retro. It just felt like the 70s.
The original design is a beast. It looks like a radio or something. You can definitely see someone having one on top of like an old 80s style VCR or a stereo system, Exactly. It is a relic of the 80s in its appearance. Yes. If you've never seen an Atari 2600 before, it's a, like Seth said, it has a wood grain front to it, and then it has this kind of like grill going up to where the cartridge slot is, which the cartridge slot is at an angle, and then it has these metal switches, either 6 of them on the original system or 4 of them on some of the later models, and they're these jutting out, and the switches are labeled BW or color for black and white and color TVs. There's a reset switch. There's difficulty switches if you want to make the game harder. You just flop a switch, Yep. There were no menus in these games, so most of it was done on the actual system. And then all of the ports, so the port for the power and the port for the plugs are actually on the rear of the system, which makes kind of plugging it in a little awkward feeling, but that was just the way it was back then.
And the controllers were just a joystick and a button.
Yes, one button.
One button, which usually did something in the game.
Yeah, it had an action.
An action, and then a joystick.
Yeah.
And the joystick moved around very similar to an arcade cabinet joystick.
Yeah.
Which very much where I think they were inspired from.
So most arcade cabinet joysticks would have switches inside of them that make clicking noises. The Atari did not have switches inside of it. It was a digital joystick, so it used contacts as opposed to physical switches. So it doesn't have a satisfying feeling to it when you're using it like an arcade joystick might have, but it is, as Seth said, inspired by the arcade joysticks of the time.
Yes, and I had another memory of the Atari 2600. We went to some other people's houses that may have been other friends, but it was different because the first people I remember, they had their Atari 2600 in like a bedroom, like an upstairs room, and then this other group of people had their 2600 in like a den in like a basement.
Oh, okay.
And that is where I played E.T. So they had a copy of E.T. And they also had a copy of Pitfall. And so I played Pitfall and E.T. at that location, and I played Combat at the first house.
Excellent.
And that's where I experienced my Atari 2600 games, all of which pretty much the three greatest games that could probably come out on the 2600.
I think those are a good, solid experience.
It's a solid spread.
A little bit of good, a little bit of bad. You got everything. It was like a charcuterie board right there.
It was. Yeah. E.T. definitely probably the best.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It certainly didn't crash an entire market. But jumping ahead a bit to talk about Atari, we have to talk about the history of Atari. Atari Incorporated was founded in 1972 by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. So previously, Bushnell and Dabney had created this game called Computer Space, which was based on a very, very early game called Space War. And Space War was this kind of like, it looks a little like Asteroids, except you're playing as two spaceships that are shooting each other, and there's a gravity well in the center. So if you go close to the gravity well, it will slingshot you around. It was fairly advanced for being a computer game made in the 1960s, but it was only available on massive computers at college universities, which is where Bushnell saw it. He was at the University of Utah, and it was on display in the computer lab on one of their terminals. So he took this idea and he thought, well, what if we made this something we could sell? And him and Dabney worked on this computer space machine, which they had some success with. A company called Nutting was the distributor for the computer space actual cabinet, but it wasn't like a hit. People didn't really play a lot of computer space, and to this day, you'll probably be surprised to find someone who remembers computer space. What it did do, though, was it set up Bushnell and Dabney with Al Alcorn, who was a brilliant designer who helped develop what became Pong. And Pong was also inspired by something else. Nolan Bushnell went to a demonstration of the Magnavox Odyssey, which was the first home video game system, and Bushnell was like, hey, we're going to do that first. So he created Pong. Pong was, as the name implies, a ping pong game. You played as one of two paddles, and there was a ball. You got to knock the ball back and forth. And it did really well in its early start. They put it into some local bars. They were making around $400 a week from those bars, from each machine. They decided that they're going to release the game under their own name as opposed to going through a distributor such as Bally or Nutting, both of which they had contracts with, and both of which they ended up closing the contracts out so that they could do their own distribution. And it cemented Atari's name in the coin-op market. And Seth and I will both talk about the coin-op industry in another episode. We're going to do an episode on, cabinets and such. So we can talk more about coin-op then. But an important note from Atari's early history was that they were a very relaxed company in the early years, pretty much up until the point they got sold to Warner Communications. There are stories of people smoking weed on the job, drinking on the job. They used to bring kegs into the office every time they had a successful game. Steve Jobs worked for Atari during some of this early period. He was actually tasked to work on the board for Breakout, which he ended up giving to Steve Wozniak, who did not work for Atari, to do the project for him. And they both, of course, left to start Apple. And then in 1975, Bushnell decided that he wanted to produce something flexible. He wanted to create something that people could have in their homes that they could do more than just Pong with. So at the time, Atari had what were dedicated consoles. They had the arcade machines in the arcades, and they had the dedicated consoles in the homes. So you had your Pong machine, you had a combat machine, you had a breakout machine, and they're these small little boxes that you plugged into your TV with controllers on them. But you couldn't do anything else with them. You could only play Pong on the Pong machine. You could only play Breakout on the Breakout machine. So Bushnell wanted to create a flexible system. And in 76, they kind of got their breakthrough when the 6502 processor came out. This allowed Atari to develop a high performance and low cost system using the CPU, which led to what became the Atari Video Computer System, which was later rebranded as the 2600 in 1977. And so this is the history leading into Atari 2600. It was, this whole project that they wanted to bring home a flexible video game system for the home market. They were not the first to do this, though. They actually were beaten to the market by almost a year or two by a company called Fairchild, which created the Fairchild Channel F. However, the Atari did much better than Fairchild. It was cheaper, it was nicer, and it had much better games, and the games were colorful. On Fairchild, you only had 4 colors. On Atari, you had tons of colors. It was amazing for people.
And which I think helped because, Atari, they're mostly their games that they were just changing into their flexible system.
Yeah.
Before we get too far away from it, the 6502 CPU is also the same name as the 6502 Collective.
That's right.
Which is the group that makes homebrew games that we talked about in our trophy episode.
That's right.
That's where they took the name of the 6502. Well, I assume they took the name.
Yeah, they took it from 6502 assembly, which was the language that you would use to communicate with the 6502 CPU.
Right.
Specifically, the Atari was using a 6507, but that's getting into the nitty-gritty. So in 1982, Atari was seeing some competitors rise up. Mattel had the Intellivision, Coleco, which was the Connecticut leather company, had the ColecoVision, both of which were more powerful systems than the Atari. Atari still had that market name, that they were considered the home video game console for people, but they were seeing some, money being lost to these competitors. Now, in 82, Atari had 2 major flops. They've had flops before, but these ones were bad. So they released a very poor port of Pac-Man, where Pac-Man isn't even a circle. The sound is weird, and the colors are off, and the, maze looks nothing like Pac-Man's maze. And then they released E.T., the extraterrestrial. So E.T. was a movie licensed game made in a very short time period. I think it was something like
6 months.
6 months, around 6 months, by Howard Scott Warshaw, whose credit at the time was Yar's Revenge, as well as Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was a pretty decent game for the Atari 2600. He wasn't given a lot of time, he wasn't given a lot of information, and what happened was the game just bombed. It did really badly. It was such a bomb for Atari that they ended up seeing tons and tons of copies getting returned to the stores and then recalled because of how badly it was doing.
Sorry, I just have to correct ourselves. So Howard Scott Warshaw, the designer of the game, was given 5.5 weeks.
Oh, so yeah. So even less time than 6 months.
So they got the negotiations to license the game in July of 1982, and Atari said to Howard Scott Warshaw, please have this available for Christmas.
Yes. Yeah. So he was given about a month to get this game out. In hindsight, it is understandable why the game may not have been as good. If you've never played E.T., it is a very ambitious game.
It did release. December of 1982.
Yeah.
He did make his deadline.
He made his deadline. And it was a very ambitious game. You played as E.T. It was multiple screens. You had to collect items. You had to collect pieces of a phone so you could phone home. And there were some other cool things but people just didn't really get it. And people didn't like it. So because of all this influx of returns, and now people were no longer interested in buying Atari games because they knew Pac-Man was terrible, they knew E.T. was terrible, they weren't going out to buy video games anymore, the market crashed. And Atari ended up facing, in about 1 year, $500 million in losses, which devastated them. To make up for the financial failure, Warner Communications began to sell off parts of Atari to different corporations. The home computing and game console division was sold to Jack Tramiel, which was fun because Jack Tramiel was actually a competitor to Atari for a while with his Commodore company, but he had recently been ousted from Commodore, so he had some time on his hands. And Namco ended up purchasing Atari Games, which was their coin-op division. So after the 83 crash, Atari released a couple more consoles. They did the 5200, 7800, as well as some home computers, but eventually they effectively stopped producing video games in the late 90s.
Well, producing hardware.
Hardware, yeah.
Because Atari is still a publisher and of video games. Like they haven't left the video game market. To
be fair, though, it is mostly Atari in name only.
Right.
It is no longer the company it was. Atari Incorporated broke apart in the 80s.
Yes.
But interestingly enough, the 2600 was actually officially supported until 1992 when it was officially discontinued, which is ridiculous to me. I mean, as a system that came out in 77 and it was officially supported until 92. And they even re-released smaller versions of it in the late 80s and 86. There were about 526 total games released between 1977 and 1982, and to this day, thanks to sites like Atari Age, new games are created by homebrew developers, such as Halo 2600, which is a port of Halo Combat Evolved for the 2600, which is amazing. Another one that just came out is Zippy the Porcupine, which is a full version of Sonic the Hedgehog for the Atari 2600, which is really impressive. But there's also some other ones that have come out now and then, and some improvements to older games, and even some Atari programmers, who've long since left the days of programming video games, are out there making homebrews. The love for the system is still very much alive, but it definitely has its place in history.
I agree.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to touch briefly on the ET game.
Yeah.
People thought ET licensed property, Christmas season, Atari made a big bet on it and made a lot of it. And then it was very bad, as we said. And so people returned the games. So they had an overproduction and a return. So they had an overabundance of inventory.
Yes.
And it was an urban legend that they actually just buried them all. That's how bad they were. That Atari just went into the desert and just filled a landfill full of them. So in 2014, there's a documentary about the ET game and the Atari crash. They went out into the desert and they dug up and confirmed that at Alamogordo, New Mexico, has a landfill that does contain many ET cartridges. Yep. And James Heller, who was an Atari manager, was in charge of the burial and has confirmed that 728,000 ET cartridges, of games, mostly ET, but also of other cartridges as well, have all been buried. It's in that landfill. So that ET could be, and has been, people have done podcasts on ET in its entirety.
Yeah.
And there's even a podcast called Brought to You By, which interviewed Howard Scott Warshaw, which I recommend listening to if you're interested in ET and the Atari crashes. They really dig into it, and it's very interesting.
I'm reading here that apparently Heller said he originally ordered the site to be covered in concrete, but apparently that just never happened. So
put him in the desert, and then just said, out of sight, out of mind.
The best part is, I'm sure if you get really deep into some of those cartridges and you popped them in the system, some of them will probably still work because those things are resilient.
Blowing it a little bit, it'll be good.
Just get the dust out. Yeah, that is always a fascinating piece of Atari's history, the video game crash and what ended up happening with ET cartridges. So there are a few games that I think I mentioned that we also mentioned earlier that were popular for the Atari. There was Combat, which came out in 77. It was actually a packaged game. Seth, you remember playing Combat, right? Or
yes.
You said you played some Combat?
I definitely played Combat. You play as top-down tanks, and one person controls one side of the tank, and the other person controls another tank, and you go at and attack each other and shoot each other and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's you're kind of like in a little maze, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think if you toggle some of the difficulty switches, it changes up the maze layout and also gives you some other gameplay modes.
Yeah.
I think there's one mode called like Pong Tank where it's like the ball bounces. Or
that's
not the
cool.
ball, but the missile will bounce around. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there was Adventure, which came out possibly in 1979, possibly 1980.
Yeah, the details on that aren't incredibly clear. And the reason being is because back then, video games were not sold the same way that we see them nowadays, where they have a ton of copyright information. They have a ton of details and stuff like that. They would have the copyright, but the games didn't even credit their artists back then, didn't even credit the programmers, didn't credit the designers.
Yeah, no, they were solely owned by the company.
Right.
So, like, Adventure was done by Atari and was owned by Atari. And it was created by Atari, not by these designers and developers. You'd have to research that to see who actually did it. Because I feel like nowadays, designers and developers have more agency than they did back then.
You're right.
Because back then they were just kind of making television sets, essentially. They were making a widget.
Yeah.
The widget was a video game.
Yeah. And it was actually an adventure that we had the birth of what became the video game Easter egg because of this exact reason. Warren Robinett, who was the designer, really wanted his name in the game. He wanted his name to be there, so he actually snuck in a line of code that displays his name in one of the rooms, and you have to do a specific set of actions to trigger this to occur. This was made famous, of course, by the book and movie Ready Player One, where I believe it's one of the ways that you get one of the keys in the challenge.
Yeah. Yes. Yep.
So that it's a very neat little thing to find. And Adventure is a cool game. It's an adventure game. You play as a square who has to travel around big squares to collect small squares and bring them to castles that look like squares.
Right.
So
yeah.
It's a very square game.
It's a very square game. It reminds me a lot of the ZZT, which was done by Epic Games, actually.
Yeah, it does. It does remind me a lot of ZZT.
I think we talked about ZZT in our episode 0.
I think we
have to go back.
I think we did. I think that was like we were just kind of like, bopping around thoughts and we mentioned ZZT, but we'd have to do a whole thing on ZZT. It's a fascinating little...
So Adventure, if you're familiar with ZZT or if you're familiar with Adventure, they are very similar in regards that you control like a little, like Zach said, like a square or some sort of like ASCII symbol and an ASCII symbol.
Yeah.
And you move around and you interact with the world using essentially the characters that's native to the computer.
Another great game for the Atari 2600 was Pitfall. So Pitfall was really cool. It was actually not developed by Atari. It was available for the system, but it was developed by Activision, which is still around to this day as a game developer. And Activision only started because of that reason of programmers and developers wanted their names on the game. And the people who developed went on to found Activision essentially went to Atari execs and said, listen, either you have us and you put us on the box, or you don't have us. And Atari said, guess we don't have you. So they left. Of course, that's not verbatim. They went on to create Activision. They produced a whole bunch of games under the Activision license. Atari took them to court and said, you can't be producing games for our system if we're not making the games. And the court said, yes, they can, because they're not ripping you off. They're literally putting things they're literally just making games. That's what they're doing. So they won the lawsuit, and because of that, we had what became third-party developers for the Atari 2600. And Pitfall is really cool. You play as Pitfall Harry, who is a man, as you go through the woods, and you have to jump over things. You have to jump over crocodiles. You have to jump over logs. And
perhaps even pits.
And pits. And it was one of the earlier, what would become side-scrolling platformers that would eventually evolve into things like Mario and Sonic, of course. But it's a little fascinating game. It's kind of cool that Activision, which was around as a bunch of disgruntled people who just wanted to have their name on it, are still around to this day, and Atari
And
really isn't.
Actually, probably a far larger company than Atari
They
is
are
now.
massive company.
I also think that most of the games that were developed for the Atari 2600, the better rated ones are the Activision ones.
Yeah, usually if you ask someone to list some Atari games, they'll probably end up listing some Activision games, like Pitfall. There was a boxing game that was really good. There was a racing game that was pretty good that was done by Activision. Barnstorming is another one where you play as a airplane and you have to like dodge birds that are in the sky and stuff like that. So there's a ton of games that were available that Activision made that became kind of staples for Atari, which ended up making Atari a little grumpy. But I assume Atari eventually had to embrace the fact that they had some competitors in terms of software now. It was cool, though, that Activision did spin off, because another thing that they wanted to do was get their games on other systems, which was a big no-no for Atari. If you were developing for Atari, you were developing for Atari. You weren't developing for Commodore and for Apple and for, Coleco and Mattel. But Activision were third party. They can do whatever they wanted, so that's what they did. They produced games for Intellivision. They produced games for Coleco. They produced games for Commodore. So they got around. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was one of the things that helped them become as successful as they are now.
Right. So I think that's good for our Atari segment.
Yeah.
Today.
Definitely more of a historical dive, I would say.
Historical dive.
But, I think in context of Atari, it's interesting to learn about the history of, games. It was this very Wild West period of development and really helped create the world that we know today in games, and we wouldn't have a lot of games that we have today if it wasn't for Atari. So
right. I feel, definitely, I think they helped solidify the rules that kind of like what esports was going through a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Where like a lot of esports was going up against trying to become, now esports are a thing. But like 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, they weren't a thing. And they had to go through and kind of establish themselves. I think any new industry really has these moments where they are kind of the Wild West. And eventually the rules are laid down. Yeah. And eventually things become... Sometimes they become a little commercialized and people start to hedge away from things that become overly commercialized. Whereas else, but it does also bring in a larger audience. Yeah. So if absolutely. Video games stayed the way that they were, the way it was back in the the early 80s, late 70s, then you would have some people that they would still be viewed as a widget versus what they are today. Yeah. Which thankfully Activision decided to take a fight to the big guys. And even a big guy.
Yeah, and even though something like the video game Crash in '83 was detrimental for Atari, without it we wouldn't have had the success of the Nintendo, which came in at the time when the Crash was at its worst, and they were able to bring the market back up to better than it was in years to come. So it's Atari's falling that gave Nintendo its rise in many ways.
We do have a special guest that will be joining us in our next episode.
Yeah, that's right.
And he may have more experience. We'll probably be talking more Atari and older game systems with this guest.
Yeah, I think so.
He is a specialist, and we won't say any more.
That's right. Yeah.
But we will have our first interview in our 25th episode, because that's exciting.
It's very exciting. That's going to be next week. So
that'll be next week.
We'll move right
whatever
along.
Week you're in.
Yeah,
it's going to be next week.
Or it might be last week if you're listening in the future.
Might be last week. Might have been some week in the past. So what about we get onto the buy, wait, pass segment?
Yeah.
Zach, what are you excited about buying, waiting, or passing on?
So the game on my buy, wait, pass for today is a game called Faith. The full name is Faith, the Unholy Trinity. And I thought it was kind of fitting to talk about this game because of its aesthetics. It does actually kind of look like an old Atari game. Or like an old, maybe like a really old MS-DOS or Apple II game or something like that. Very, very simple graphics, like plain colors, no gradients on the colors or anything. But Faith is an 8-bit inspired horror game where you play as a young priest who's struggling against demons, cultists, and his own weakening faith. And you are going through a town that's being haunted by demons. It's also inspired by what was known as the kind of satanic panic of the 1980s. This was a period in time where everyone thought that satanic cults were real and were out to get you.
D&D was bad.
Yeah, it was a lot of confusion, a lot of miscommunication that existed in that time period that led to that fear. But this game is inspired by that time period. It looks like a really cool game, and I've played the demo. So the demo is free right now on Steam. The demo is a nice glimpse into how the game's going to be. I liked it. I think I'm going to put it on a buy. However, I wish I could tell you more about when it's coming out. Its planned release date is soon, and then they trademarked soon. So it says, planned release date, soon in all capitals, trademark. So who's to say?
You can play the demo.
Yeah. So yeah, I recommend it, and I am looking forward to picking it up when it is fully available. What about you, Seth? Buying, waiting, passing, what are you going to do?
So there's a game that actually came out a couple of years ago, but it's still in early access. So I'm going to put it down as my buy, wait, pass since it's still in early access.
There you go.
If it's in early access, it hasn't come out yet.
Yeah, perfect.
So this game is called Breath Edge, and you play the life of a simple man, capital M,
Okay.
with very simple needs.
Capital N?
Such as M, man.
No, I know, but needs, capital N.
Oh, no, just regular needs.
Okay.
Who's trying to survive while in deep space.
All right.
So you have to explore space, build stuff, according to the description of the game, kick corpses and poke everything with a chicken. So one of the items that you get in the game is apparently a live chicken that is immortal.
Okay.
And you can use it to do things with it, like poke electrical currents and fill in tubes.
As you do.
But the chicken's immortal, so it's okay. It doesn't die. It is a space survival game, kind of akin to Subnautica, which is a game that takes place where you're in a submarine and you're trying to like get out into the world of the ocean and try and survive underwater.
Yeah.
Where this game will take place where you're in a little space station and you're trying to get places out in space and you have limited oxygen.
Yeah.
So it looks fun. They are running a sale on the game where it's 30% off till the 18th, which is tomorrow. And the game retails for $19.99 and it's MSRP'd at $13.99. So I think this is going to be a buy for me. It looks funny and light, which is something that I've kind of been feeling the need for. I like Subnautica, so I'll probably like this game. And I'll probably buy it before the sale is over.
Nice. Well, hey, maybe it'll be something that we show on our Twitch.
Perhaps we can show it on our Twitch, or I'll talk about it in our recently played segment.
Perfect. Well, I think that just about does
puts a fork in this episode.
Put a fork in this episode. It's done.
It's done.
It is well done.
It is well done. All right. Well, there is a number of ways that you can contact us, listen to us, and support us.
You want to tell me about this?
Sure.
All
You
right.
can contact us by going to our website and going to the contact form and filling that form out and sending it to us. We will read said form and respond to you.
Well,
you
Seth
can also... I will, yes, not Zach. You can also send an email to classicgamingbrothers@gmail.com. If you send this email or you send this contact form, we will put you in a random drawing to receive a game, which we will do a drawing for in our 26th episode. Because our 25th episode is going to be primarily taken up by our interview with our special guest. So then you can...
Not because we forgot.
We always forget to do it. But now I've committed us. You can listen to us on where all podcasts are listened to. If there is a podcast application that we are not on, you can ask for us to be put onto it, and we will try our darndest to get put onto it. But we are, Stitcher, iTunes, Google, iHeartRadio, Acast, Castbox. We're there. We also get picked up by repeaters. So like there's the main one that gets played, and then there's like companies like Castbox and Podcast Addict, which are essentially repeaters. They just pick up on RSS feeds that are in main, like Stitcher and stuff like that. So we're pretty much everywhere.
I thought you meant like we're picked up on like AM repeaters. So like if you're driving out in like the countryside somewhere and you tune in at the right time, you might catch the dulcet tones of classic Brothers.
I could do that, right? I could get something to just push out from my house.
Yeah, you could. It might be an FDA violation.
There's somebody that plays Christmas music on a certain channel.
All right, well, let's do it.
Yeah,
just get a little.
It'll be great.
AM
Only
transfer.
within 200 feet of my house, you can listen to us and repeat.
There you go.
Maybe perfect. I could do it with my maybe I can figure out my Raspberry Pi and make it do that. And then finally, you can support us by liking, subscribing, sharing, ringing bells, following us on Twitch, YouTube. Our Twitch is Classic Gaming Brothers. Zach's view is VS Classic Gaming Brothers. Our YouTube is Classic Gaming Brothers. Our Facebook and Instagram are Classic Gaming Brothers, and our Twitter is CG Brothers Pod. So feel free to like, follow, subscribe, share. We also have a merchandise store where you can buy shirts and coffee mugs. If you're listening to this during the COVID-19 situation, don't expect the package to arrive anytime soon. Our shipping and our print shops are delayed, and we're running about a month behind in production.
Yeah.
So good luck. We'll still take your money, but we won't send you anything for a long time. But you'll get it eventually.
Yeah.
So with that said, Zach, is there anything else?
Don't play games like my brother.
And don't play games like my brother.
I've been Zach.
And I've been Seth.
Nice! And we've been the Classic Gaming Brothers.
And we've been the Classic Gaming Brothers. Wait, why'd you say nice like that? That was unnecessary.
Well, it's nice. It's nice
that
we've
I'm
been
Seth.
that you've been Seth and I've been Zach.
Yes, it would be weird if we were somebody else.
It would also be weird if we both were Seth.
It would be weird if we were both Seth.
Alright, I'm gonna play the music.
Play the music.